Good morning. So what is the allergy thing about? I'm affected. And you said drinking helped? Well, we're making so much progress in interfaith work, that I understand that some Catholics have started to eat meat on Friday, and some Jews are starting to eat pork, and some Baptists are recognizing each other in the liquor store. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. So I'm calling this talk today, Embracing Evidential and Evolutionary Spirituality. Embracing Evidential and Evolutionary Spirituality. And this has grown out of a question that I keep playing with much of the time these days. And that question is, how are we to live consciously religious lives using specifically spiritual metaphors in this time between the no longer and the not yet? I need to say that again. How are we to live consciously, that is, be aware, spiritual lives using specifically spiritual metaphors, language, in this time between the no longer and the not yet? And obviously, I'm giving these talks in an ecclesiastical context, and I do so as one who is a Christian. Now, if you ask Matt Russell what is a Christian, if he is a Christian, he will say, I don't know. Tell me what you think a Christian is, and I will tell you whether I am that or not. My current understanding of what it means to be a Christian is to enthusiastically embrace the goal of living a life that reflects the values that grow from a knowledge of and a trust in God that Jesus demonstrated. This raises a lot of questions. Was Jesus really serious about what he taught? Did he intend that followers take him seriously? Was he serious when he said that the greatest metaphor, the greatest of all the commandments was love of neighbor? Did he really mean it when he said, people will know that you belong to me by the way you love one another? And if all of that is true, what applicability does that have for us? So the very stance of wanting to honor the teachings of Jesus begins to shape the answer to the question of living in this time when clearly an old order is passing away and the struggle to establish a new one we don't have one firmly in place. And you would have to be culturally deaf and blind not to realize that there are a lot of competing answers out there claiming that they have the answer for how things ought to be. Political, religious, and otherwise. And maybe the globalization of our time, the multiculturalism of our time, means that there won't be a taken for granted narrative like there once was, or like I thought there was when I was a kid growing up in Tennessee. I know that my grandchildren live in a world that I could not even have imagined when I was a child. Who would have thought, for example, that it is possible to do what I can do this afternoon, which is to stand in my kitchen cooking supper and ask Alexa to put an item on my shopping list, remind me to do something 2 days from now, tell me a pun, play a song, Tell me when the next Rockets game is going to be on, which is 2:30 this afternoon. Who would have thought that's a possibility? So how can we live consciously religious lives using specifically spiritual metaphors, even Christian ones, in this context and time? Now, one brief answer to that is that we embrace the work involved, and I've already spoken to this in a whole class about there's work involved in consciously embracing what it means to move from being religious believers to religious knowers. Moving from being a believer to a knower. I read Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, when it first came out in 2005. Sam Harris is one of those people who, along with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, are spokespeople for what is called the new atheism. And I think, especially as a religious spiritual teacher, it's very important to know what these people say. What it is that they're critiquing when they make their case for atheism, which is largely a critique of Christianity that goes no further than flat earth faith. Now, you remember that flat earth faith is a term I got from Michael Dowd. Flat earth faith is a religion that's constructed on documents and doctrines by people who believe the earth was flat or that the earth was the center of the universe. And that covers a lot of material. All the Bible, all the creeds. When we get up and say the Apostles' Creed in church, that creed is flat earth theology, flat earth faith. At any rate, in Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, he wrote, and yes, it is surprising that such a forward-thinking man could use such sexist language, but his point remains a telling one. This is Harris. Tell a devout Christian that his wife is cheating on him, or that frozen yogurt can make a man invisible, and he's likely to require as much evidence as anyone else, and to be persuaded only to the extent that you give him that evidence. Tell him that the book he keeps by his bed was written by an invisible deity who will punish him with fire for eternity if he fails to accept its ever incredible claim about the universe, and he seems to require no evidence whatsoever. Now, I would add that many people who call themselves Christian can go into a wide variety of negative reactions, all the way from moderate defensiveness to downright violent anger, when something they perceive as critical is said about the Bible or the faith that they hold. But if we're going to construct new ways of thinking, believing, and knowing, we have to look very carefully at how it is that people, and I'm thinking now people who identify as religious, and particularly people who identify as Christian religious, have come to believe what they believe. We live in a very crazy-making, religious, paradoxical situation. Though the multiculturalism that I spoke of earlier is a fact, meaning that other religions like Islam, Mormonism, and none, that is, those who don't identify by belief or behavior with any organized religion, all these groups are growing in our culture. Islam, Mormonism, nuns are all growing in our culture, and yet the majority of people would think and identify that this is a Christian nation. If they had a box to check on, what are you, they might check the Christian box. And certainly, even though religious illiteracy in the United States is staggering, people mostly know that what it means to be a Christian is to believe the Bible. That's a crazy-making context. There are a lot of reasons for this, and I'm not going into them in this talk. Here's the goal that I have for this talk. I would like to persuade you, if you are not already of such a conviction, to move from what is considered a traditional flat earth faith to what I am calling evidential evolutionary spirituality. And if you're already in that camp, what I would like to do is to give you information that you could use when you have conversations with people outside of here to facilitate their making such a move. How can we move from being religious believers to spiritual knowers? When Carl Jung was here in Houston, he was asked, do you believe in God? And his famous answer is, no, I know. I don't believe, I know. So we want to make that transition. It's a very difficult transition. I've already likened it to moving to another country, another culture, needing to learn a new language, needing to learn new customs. So I want to just repeat what I began with today and then illustrate our context. Did Jesus mean what he said? Or was he just kidding? And if he did mean it, does following him mean taking seriously what he said? Or are we just supposed to believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that settles everything? My current understanding of what it means to be Christian is to enthusiastically embrace the goal of living a life that reflects the values that grow from a knowledge of and trust in the God that Jesus had. Values, trust, and that. So to this end, there was a scathing piece found of all places in the comic pages last Sunday. It was the Doonesbury cartoon. And I read it as I do when I go home from church on Sunday, and I want to share it with you. In it, a pastor is making an announcement from the pulpit. And he says, one final announcement from the Board of Elders. There has been some confusion among evangelicals as to what currently constitutes sin in the eyes of the church. So to clarify, we now condone the following conduct: lewdness, vulgarity, profanity, adultery, and sexual assault. Exemptions to Christian values also include greed, bullying, conspiring, boasting, lying, cheating, sloth, envy, wrath, gluttony, and pride, others to be announced. Lastly, we're willing to overlook biblical illiteracy, church non-attendance, and no credible sign of faith. As people leave the church, they say things to the pastor like, loving the low bar, Pastor. And me too, I feel like a freaking saint now. And the pastor says, enjoy. So what does it mean for the church to be faithful to Jesus in this culture? And to honor the values that Jesus taught, lived, that grew out of his relationship with God. Now, it seems to me that one function of the church is to do theology publicly. That is, to communicate these values with both boldness and a sense of humility. The boldness that says, yes, Jesus meant what he taught. He died for it. And to do so with humility. Augustine said, if you think you comprehend God, it's not God you're talking about. So, let's begin with this. How do we know what we know? Sometimes Sherry and I will be out walking at night, and there will be just a sliver of moon in the sky. And my father taught me when I was a little kid, and I would see this. He taught me this was called a fingernail moon. Have you ever heard that phrase? I was 4, and I asked him why the moon was that way, because I was used to seeing it like this. And my father told me that the moon keeper put a ladder up against the moon and took a bite out of it. And left only a fingernail, and I believed him. I was 4 years old. 4-year-old people believe what their parents tell them. People used to believe that Thor pulled the sun across the sky, and that the stars were tiny pinpricks in the ceiling of the Earth's sky. So how do we know what's so? How do we now know that the sun is a big ball of fire that is 93 million miles from the earth? How do we know that? Well, we have evidence. Evidence comes in all sorts of forms. Sometimes it comes from our own seeing, our own hearing, our own sensing that something is true, or we come to believe something is true because we've been told it by others whom we trust. So we have astronauts who have traveled into space, and they can both tell us and show us pictures of a round Earth turning on its axis. I see a bright star in the evening sky and say, look at the star, and somebody who is much better informed than I say, no, that's not a star, that's a planet we call Venus. Looks like a star to me. But I trust him. He knows more than I do. A detective working on a murder case can gather all sorts of clues. Perhaps no one single clue conclusively proves that the suspect committed the murder. But by putting enough clues together, it begins to make sense that the butler did it in the library with a knife. You know that thing. So we're going to begin in a few weeks to look at the miracles that are reported in the Hebrew and Christian writings. And we'll look for what evidence is there that these things took place. Did Jesus, for example, really walk on water? When we were in California last week, I heard a new phrase I had not heard before. Somebody asked what I would have to drink with a meal, and the other person at the table said, would you like some Jesus water? And I said, what's that? He said, wine. Have you ever known anybody to walk on water? Then scholars began to discover that there are miracle stories in all the creation, in all the religious traditions. Why? To what end? And why have they stopped? Why did miracles happen in ancient times but not now? Some of you are old enough to remember when there used to be a lot of sightings of flying saucers and alien abductions. But ever since the advent of the cell phone camera, not so much. Evidence and the credibility of trusted witnesses are good reasons for believing something is true. Now, there are bad reasons for believing things, if not bad reasons, risky ones. One of these is tradition. I have told a version of this before, so some of you forgive the repetition. But as you likely know, because I'm very open about the way I work and self-revealing in my work, I grew up in a church-going family. We went to the largest church in Columbia, Tennessee, which was a Baptist church. And I was told both implicitly and explicitly that ours was the church that had the truth. Unlike the poor Episcopalians, we were free to make up our prayers and not read them from a prayer book. We were also free to interpret the Bible however we wanted, and unlike the Catholics, didn't have to think the Pope was infallible, not eat meat on Friday, or try to have as many babies as possible. And unlike the Methodists, we didn't sprinkle babies, but we fully immersed real believers as soon as they could make a personal decision for Jesus Christ. Now, I knew growing up that I was what I was because that's what my parents were. If they had been Episcopalian, I would have been Episcopalian. If they had been, oh God forbid, Church of Christ, I would have been that. But I lucked out. I won the religious lottery. I got born into the right doctrinal tradition. And I firmly believe this until I started having true conversations with other people who had grown up in different traditions and who believed the same thing they believed about their tradition as I believed about mine. And I knew that we both couldn't be right, or that we both were. There's a story about this young woman in her first year of marriage who wants to replicate for her husband the Easter feast that she grew up with in her own family. So in her first year of marriage, when the first Easter comes around, she calls her mother and she gets the recipe and she gets all the things that she is to serve. And right before they hang up, the mother says to her, now be sure when you buy the ham, tell the butcher to cut off 3 inches of the short end. You'll use that to make soup later. Why do we do that? That is what I've always been taught to do. My mother taught me to do that. You'll have to talk to her about it. So the girl goes and talks to her grandmother and says, Grandma, why don't we cut off 3 ends of the Easter ham? She said, oh, it's a family tradition. We've always done it. My mother did it. This is a young family. So the great-grandmother is in an assisted living place. So eventually the young woman goes to visit her. And she asked, it's a family tradition. We've always done it. Why do we do that? Why do we cut off 3 inches from the small end of the Easter ham? What's the significance of that? And the great-grandmother says, I don't know why the rest of you do it, but that's the only way I could get it to fit in the roast. Now, people have religious beliefs that come from traditions that are just as silly. Perhaps given the context of the time they made sense, but no longer. And sometimes the very fact that something is old makes it seem so special. I started being involved in the worship services here at St. Paul's in 1982, 83, something like that. And before they redid the sacristy, there was a cork board that was in the sacristy that had been there forever. And I think Moses put it up. It had a cartoon from a newspaper on it. Yellow piece of paper. I think it was cut out of the New Yorker. And it showed a minister who was about to be hung. And you could tell he was a minister because of his garb. And the caption says, I tried to tell him not to change the order of service. The trouble with tradition is that no matter how long ago something was made up, it's still made up. It's still as true or as untrue as once it was, or perhaps as reasonable or unreasonable. If something comes into being, like cutting 3 inches off the small end of the Easter ham and handing it down over the generations doesn't make it special or true, and its original meaning can be lost. Christians, Jews, Muslims, different forms of Christians like Catholics and Protestants, Orthodox, different forms of Muslims, different kinds of Jews, have been taught by their parents and religious leaders traditions that they have gone to war over. Think of North Ireland, South Ireland. Their different beliefs are due to different traditions. So as we go forward in this theme, I'll be talking about some of the particulars of the Christian tradition that fall into the category of the Easter ham, and yet which to this day people have hateful disagreements about. Made up stories, simply taken seriously because they were handed down from one generation to another. And ironically, the older something is, the more revered it is. Another bad reason for believing something is because somebody told you to believe it. I call this the problem with authority. Now, I don't need to tell you who are gathered here how much damage has been done to so many lives by fundamentalist, conservative, even mainline churches. The institutional church has not liked to own up to its own bloody history over the centuries, but in its effort to gain a large, powerful presence in the world, the church stepped on a lot of people. Think of the Crusades. But I'm not even talking today about that history. I'm talking about what has been done to people, some of them in this room, or who have been told by people in authority, whom they believed and trusted, that they were going to go to hell for doing such and such, or for not believing certain things. One of the quieter but nonetheless damaging things that the church has taught people is that it's bad to ask questions. To question things, people have been told, especially things held central to a particular church or denomination, shows a lack of faith. Faith here means primarily believing certain things to be true, except that's not the primary meaning of faith. Faith primarily means a relationship. Blind faith, believing things just because one has been told to believe them, leads to gullibility and a shallow spiritual life. It leads to people never growing up, but remaining in a dependent, childish, developmental level. Because it has nothing substantial to stand up to or stand up on, this kind of faith falls flat when it's put to the challenges of real life in tough times. I've said to you numerous times, I've seen more people give up on the spiritual journey, on having a life-enhancing relationship with the sacred, because they have been led to believe that God would protect them or their loved ones from some calamity if they prayed hard enough for some inevitable difficulty or disappointment to be spared them, and that would not happen, and they gave up. Thomas Aquinas said, clearly, the person who accepts the church as an infallible guide will believe whatever the church teaches. While working on this talk, I ran across a Chinese proverb I had not heard before. If it's not a Chinese proverb, it ought to be. The person who asks a question is a fool for 5 minutes. The one who does not ask a question remains a fool forever. Children are masters at this. It's how they learn. One child authority says that between ages 2 and 5, the average child asks 40,000 questions. Unfortunately, as we grow into adulthood, the number of questions we ask drops off dramatically. But, knowing how to ask a good question is an important, critically important skill. It helps us develop our own opinions, our own beliefs, instead of just mindlessly adopting them from some other people or institution. It's out of asking good questions that we develop the skill to make good choices. Good choices determine the shape of our lives. And not making good choices in our spiritual work is just as unfortunate. Well-formed spirituality helps us construct lives of meaning, know who we are, live with purpose, make positive impacts with our lives, to play the best roles we can in making our lives and the lives of the neighbor we have been given to love better. The great thinkers of the world tell us that it is in asking the right questions, and often they're simple ones, that lead to great breakthroughs. My point is that it's in asking questions rather than having answers that we grow our faith. The very notion of evolution implies that we're not finished, that we haven't arrived, that there's more to come, that there's more growing. I find this exciting and energizing. We don't have a final answer. I don't. Maybe we won't ever. I am saying that this lack of certainty is much more at the heart of spiritual work than religious certitude. I'm coming more and more to see that the heart of spiritual work is simply to create a nurturing context for spiritual mystery to find its expression. Fundamentalists in all religions, certainly Christian fundamentalists, they got all the answers. That's the height of egotism and self-importance. We now have scholarship that can help us understand how we got to where we are, especially when it comes to religion. All religions are human constructs. Religious impulses have been around since the beginning of time. Not the Christian religion, certainly not. Even belief in a theistic deity, that's not been around since maybe 8,000 BC. It's young. That's young when you think of the history of the world. That's young. You have to wonder, why did that come about? We'll talk about that beginning some next week. Religions, you can find religious impulses if you go back as far as archaeologists can go to burial customs. You see religious impulses in the way that people were buried. Religions came into being to give people answers. Where do we come from? And so a creation story was told. That story was invented and then told. And people took that invented story as time passed as being more than just a story. They came to think it is revealed truth. Not part of public revelation, as scientists work in, but the private revelation from God. One of the things I'm doing in this current series of talks is taking a look at other truths that come from our religious tradition and simply asking questions about them. And the answers to those questions will be rooted in evidence and not in simply accepted because we've always done it this way. We've always believed this. This is what Baptists believe or what Methodists do. Ever since I first found it years ago, I have loved the lines that come from the poet Rainier Maria Rilke. Be patient with all that is unsolved in your hearts, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek the answers which cannot be given, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distance day into the answer. I love that. That'll be in the summary that goes out. During the time I was working on the Gospel of Thomas, I tried to learn what I could about the sacred feminine, because there's a lot of the sacred feminine in the Gospel of Thomas. And I learned a lot, and one of the main things I learned is that I'm not qualified to speak to it, because I'm not a feminine. It really takes a woman to be able to do that. And I'll ask a colleague of mine to come and do that in the not too distant future. But during that time, I learned a lot about the women in the New Testament, particularly about Mary. You know, there's very, 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 very little said about Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the gospel tradition. Very little. Only in 2 Gospels. And in one Gospel, she and her other children go to where Jesus is to get him to come out because they think he's crazy. But we don't play that story up very much. One branch of the Christian church, and I'm not picking on the Roman Catholics, teaches that Mary didn't die like everybody else. Mary got assumed into heaven, lifted up into heaven. The doctrine is called the Assumption of Mary. Now, although there are hints that this belief developed about 600 years after the death of Jesus, it did not become a doctrine in the Catholic Church until 1950. It's just a story. It developed sometime before 1950, but it's like the end that's cut off of the Easter ham. It got handed down from generation to generation until one day the church said, we're going to make this a doctrine. There is no evidence for it. This touches on another reason people believe things to be true, and that's revelation. And this goes all the way from the crazy person who said, God told me to shoot that person, to the claim that God reveals certain truths to people like Moses or to one of the gospel writers. Now, I wish that these matters of tradition and authority were easy to sort out, but they're not. You know, we have to learn to swim in a sea into which we're born. And we need certain kinds of skills and information to navigate this sea in which we are thrown. One of the skills that we need is a language to speak to the other fish in the sea around us. This language was invented and handed to us. Nothing sacred about the English language over the French or Spanish language or some other language. It's just a particular tool that we need to navigate in a culture where most of the other people speak English. We were handed a lot of other things by our parents, by our grandparents, by the tribes of which we were part. Some of what we were handed was true, and some of it wasn't. In the beginning, as young children, we can't sort out what's true and what's not. I really believe the moon keeper took a bite out of the moon. And if we take something that is not evidentially true and hand that on to our children, they are likely to take that as true as well. A lot of religious beliefs are like that. So we're going to look as we go forward at things like, is the Bible literally true, or should it be taken that way? Was Jesus born of a virgin? Could he perform miracles? Did he die to keep people from going to hell? And the way we know whether there's truth to that or not is to look at the evidence. Do people believe what they believe because of evidence? Or is it the kind of thing people believe because of tradition, authority, and revelation? Those are two really different things. Now, I confess to you, if it's not already obvious, that I am feeling my way along in these talks. Unlike the Gospel of Thomas, which you just did one passage right after another, or a time when I did the parables of Jesus going through the New Testament, or the Beatitudes, or something like that. These talks are not organized in any particular order. But folks, neither is life. It's an illusion to think it is. So we can go along for a way thinking that things are in order, and then we hit a speed bump. And those speed bumps can be really valuable because they jar us into awakening. Embracing an evidential evolutionary spirituality is one where the unknown and mystery are the order of the days. And these, I would argue, are the qualities of God. Now, I confess to you that though I know there is an incredible resistance out there against the idea of evolution, I do not understand why so many people who claim to follow Jesus are threatened by it. What is this attachment to inertness? Is it that static things are more controllable? Now, from a psychological perspective, I know human psyche's need for security, but I also know that security, stability, and superiority are illusions. The drive to create a world that is secure and safe is destroying us. These ego needs can allow people to ignore or misinterpret what's actually going on around us, to avoid growing up, to miss out on the true healing process. When the Christian church was getting its shape from the Roman Empire in the 4th century, it was way influenced more by the Roman Empire and by Aristotle than by Jesus. You're aware of that. Aristotle, you might recall, understood God as the unmoved mover. God moves things, but God is unmoved. And now we know that that's not true. The evidence is, because that's static, that's unchanging. That is not the God even presented in the Judeo-Christian tradition, a God who is clearly much more of a verb than a noun. And yet the God who lives in most people's mind is a stable, old, white man sitting on a throne, a critical, punitive spectator to creation that is just ticking away until the second coming. What a negative worldview. This is not a God you will fall in love with, because love demands a relationship, give and take. I'm still reading this book, which I don't know whether to recommend or not. It's one that Ilia Delio and then Richard Orr is very high on this particular book. Darmud or Murchie's Quantum Theology, Spiritual Implications for the New Physics. And in it he writes, in the very beginning of this book, what to me is a beautiful invitation, which I would like to issue to me. He says, come with me on a journey of exploration. Let's link arms in a trajectory whose direction and destiny we'll discover as we go along. Enter into the experience of searching, seeking, exploring, and I hope discovering. Participate in the task rather than remain a mere observer. You can read a book about swimming, or you can jump into the water. I'm encouraging you to embrace evidential, evolutionary spirituality. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo, so watch your step, and I will see you here next week.